anybody would like, and I'll draw attention to the consent agenda, which is listed first, items C1, C2, and C3. If you wish to discuss it and make any a discussion on that, please speak up now for changes to the agenda and pull that off the consent agenda, which is our action item 4. Otherwise,
I
it's
just have
going
a
to sail through.
procedural question,
Go ahead, Jeff.
Chair. In the consent agenda, we usually take one vote en masse. But the problem is the safety targets are an MPO action, and then the minutes are, you know, what they are for everybody. And then the item number 3, the South Burlington plan approval is, South Burlington plan approval is also a municipal vote. How do we deal with the fact that one vote is for MPO only and doesn't include everybody, and the other 2 includes everybody?
Well, I think that's perfect time for you. You've made a great point. It is a mixed hybrid. If you were to have some attention drawn to the minutes of particular concern, then we could pull that off the consent agenda, and then the consent agenda would be MPO business only. Does that work, Jeff?
No, well, it doesn't quite work because the city plan approval is just the municipalities, which is actually a different subgroup than the MPO vote. So I'm sorry, I listed it. So in my mind, we had to do 3 separate small actions. But they were going to have to be separate, unfortunately, as far as
which defies the consent agenda.
Well, it removes the discussion still, right?
It's true, because you have to pull it off if you want to discuss it, but if you just need to vote on it.
So I would move that we take item C3 off the consent agenda and leave, well, actually C2 and C3, right? Off the consent agenda and leave C1 on the consent agenda.
Where when we're voting on the consent agenda for C1,
it's an MPO vote.
Right.
Only.
And then in action item 4.5, we'll address the minutes and the city plan approval as separate actions.
Right. And we have to do minutes separate as well.
Right. You just
had
mentioned taking that off. So there would be 3 items done in at 4. So we'll have 4.0 as safety targets, 4.5 as
it was a good try though, Mr. Executive Director.
And 4.75 as the South Burlington City Plan. Is that fair? Everybody clear on that? Okay, great. And thank you for, is the right word perspicacity? I can't pronounce that correctly anymore. Particular attention to detail, Jeff. That's good.
We do need a second, and we have to vote on changing the consent agenda, and then we have to vote on the consent agenda as it remains, right?
Well, when we get there, yes. So do we have a second for these changes as described?
I'll second.
Thank you, Bart. I saw his hand go up first, Catherine. Thank you.
Okay, I missed it. Yeah.
All right. Any further discussion of the changes we're making to the agenda?
I need to make the screen bigger.
Then by general acclaim, can we have that change made, Charlie? All right. No need to vote on that, or do we need a vote on that?
I think you probably do need a quick vote.
All right. So all those in favor, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
And
Aye.
anyone abstaining, please speak up or type in. Very good. And thank you. It looks like Eliana has joined us, so I appreciate that as well. So we'll look forward to Eliana and Trudy shortly. Action item number 2 is public comment on items not on the agenda for tonight. Is anyone here from the public who would like to speak up? Please speak up at this point or type in on the chat. Hearing or seeing none. So we're going to move on to agenda item number 3, staff introductions. We have 2 new staff members, Eliana Fox and Trudy. I'm going to try and pronounce the last name, and I can't find it on my screen here. So you're kind enough. How about I start with you, Namubiru? Is that correct, Trudy? Trudy, are you ready?
Yes.
Did I do okay with that?
Yes. It's the way it sounds, the way it's spelled.
Very good.
Yeah.
So we'd love to hear about you and how you arrived at CCRPC.
Yeah, my name is Trudy Namubiru. I'm sorry I don't have a clear video because my lighting is not so good. back here. But my name is Trudy Namoviru. I I am a mother, first and foremost, to an 8-year-old. I have experience in accounting and finance because that's what I studied. Okay, I won't say I'm still a new American, but I've been in America for the last 6 years. I came from Uganda, and my experience is I worked with the State Department, that was American Embassy, for about 7 years in finance. And then I relocated to the US in 2018. I got my paperwork straight and I started I got a job with CVOEO in 2020. That is Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. I don't know if you know something about it. And I was accounts payable specialist. So I was with them for about 4 years. And it was a good place to work. It was and as you know, it's a non-profit organization, and everybody was nice until I saw an advert with CCRPC, and it spoke to me, and I wanted to grow because once you start this career process, you need somewhere where you have to grow, and this was a good opportunity for me to grow. And I applied I got an interview, and when I stepped in the office for the first time, I, for some reason, felt home. Like I felt home. Like I felt so good. It spoke to me, and I knew this was my place for me.
Excellent.
Yes, and I right now I'm working with the business office, and everybody is so great, and I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to work with the loveliest people I've ever met. And I am sure that I'm gonna be here for a long time because it seems everybody has been there for a long time. So it means no one is willing to leave. So it means
That's
it's that good. So
That's great to hear. And so you work with Forrest and Amy in the
yes,
business office?
yes,
Thank you. And there's nothing more solid than walking into a brick building. It always impresses me. So especially one that's 2, 3 floors high, there's a solidity to that. Well,
yeah.
welcome and thank you. You said an 8-year-old child, not an 18-year-old child, I
No,
hope.
no, no, 8. She's 8 years. She's in second
Excellent.
grade.
And do you live local in Winooski or
I
in
no,
Chittenden County?
I live in Burlington. Yeah, Chittenden. I live in Burlington and
Mhm.
St. Paul Street. Yeah.
Well, good. I'm
So,
glad the commute hopefully won't be too long and the bridge construction that's upcoming won't be too interfering. Would anyone else like to ask Trudy questions about working with Forrest, Amy, or otherwise? And if not, thank you, Trudy. Thank you very much and welcome aboard. And we do hope to see you for a long time and meet you in person.
yes.
So Eliana, welcome. I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us how you arrived at CCRPC and what you do here.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name's Eliana Fox. I'm a new transportation planner on the staff. I started right at the beginning of January, so I'm 6 or 7 weeks in, and I can definitely echo Trudy's sentiments. It's just been, really one of the best parts. Has been wonderful with the staff at the RPC, getting to know everyone. Everyone is kind and engaging and wanting to teach us, and so I'm feeling really grateful for that. So yeah, I've been in Burlington since 2015. I graduated from UVM in 2019. After that, I worked at various odd internships at UVM's transportation office, at their transportation research center, at the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition. So have a lot of, transportation background. It was more transportation programming than planning. So this has definitely been, like a career lane shift for me, not really a career direction change. So I've been sort of adjacent to planning, I guess, and am now really excited to be in it. But most recently, I was the transportation coordinator at Champlain College for almost 2 years. So, managing parking system and the shuttle system and all of that important transportation demand management aspect of that institution, I guess. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my background, and I'm really enjoying the work and my colleagues so far, and look forward to working with all of you more in the
Thank
future.
you. It
Yeah.
sounds like you have some good experience in transportation coming on board with us that is needed as much as Trudy's experience with our business office is presently overwhelmed. Our transportation planning department is also presently, as I'm sure you've discovered in the last 6 or 7 weeks, got piles to be worked on.
Yeah.
Anything you can do to influence South Burlington's Market Street on-street parking, I'll be very grateful for. That's my pet peeve I'll constantly come back to, especially as we build these 5-story apartments right on top of
Mhm.
subsidized free parking.
Well,
with-
Chris, I love talking about parking, so
Oh, I
let's get
sensed
into
that.
it.
So I'm not here and not now tonight, but thank you
Okay.
very much. Anyone with questions for Eliana on follow-up or otherwise want to know more about what she might be working on? Bruce, is that you with a hand up?
Yes. Hey, Eliana, thank you for a couple things. Thank you for coming to Chittenden County Regional Planning to work with us, and your background in transportation is incredible. But most importantly, thank you for graduating from UVM and staying in Vermont, because we need people like you to stay in Vermont. We don't want you to go nowhere. So just thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Oh, thanks, Bruce. That's really nice. I have people who have rooted me here, so no plans on leaving anytime soon.
Fabulous. I see Andy Watts' hand from Williston. We have 2 Andy Wattses, but this one is Williston Andy.
Oh, I was just applauding what Bruce said. That's all.
Oh,
And
okay.
agreed.
That-
It was not meant to be the hand. It was the
Yeah.
little
No,
clapping.
I misread the emojis. I'm not quite emojified as some folks are, but thank you.
But I second
Appreciate
that.
Anyone else? Thank you. If not, thank you, Eliana, and welcome aboard as well. So Eliana and Trudy, 2 newest members of our staff, thank you and welcome, and thank you for coming and presenting to us. We appreciate it. We'll move on to the action item or agenda item 4.0, which is going to be just C1 safety targets from the consent agenda, which is
Chair, I move approval of the safety targets.
Thank you. Second for that. That would be Bard. Thank you. I saw that. I saw Andy try. And again, Charlie, this is MPO business only. All right. So MPO members, please, all those in favor, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed or abstaining, please speak up. Okay, that looks unanimous. Let's move to agenda item 4.5, formerly consent agenda C2, the minutes of the January 17th board meeting. Anyone move?
I move approval with Catherine's updates.
Thank you, Jeff. And any seconds? Thank you, Andy Montreal. Any discussion, any edits? Not seeing or hearing any. All those in favor, please say aye. This is a general
Aye.
vote. And anyone opposed or abstaining, please speak up.
Brad Holden, abstain.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, there we go. Moving on to agenda item 4.75, the South Burlington City Plan. This will need municipal votes, so not the regional board members necessarily. Can I get a motion to approve South Burlington City Plan? Someone who's not from South Burlington, he said in his best interests.
Move to approve.
I'm sorry, who is that?
Move to approve. It's Andy.
Andy, thank you. Andy Montreal. And a second.
I
Second.
Who was that? Who seconded first?
Ben Bornstein. No.
Chuck or whatever.
Okay, I'll take Ben. Thank you. All those in any discussion needed on this item? Anyone would like to make any points on South Burlington City Plan? Hearing and seeing none, I'll ask for all those in favor, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed or abstaining to please speak up. Okay, that motion passed. You guys are great. Doing
Good
good.
dog, Dana.
Thank you. Very cute. Now, agenda item 5, Vermont Futures Project. We have Kevin Chu. Kevin, I'll leave the floor to you. How are you? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm actually going to kick things off with a video before diving into a presentation. Hopefully I can provide some information that's valuable, but if not, we'll start off with a little bit of humor. So let me cue up my screen here. All right. All right. I'll switch over to my presentation and contextualize why I showed that video. So I want to begin with this question: who is Vermont for? It may seem like a simple question, but when we start asking it, it gets complex really quickly. And the reason why I like asking it is because if we don't answer this for ourselves, other people will do it for us. Again, Saturday Night Live just being one example, and they have a pretty large audience, but it shapes the narrative about who Vermont is for. And I think that we need to start taking control of that narrative. So I'll say a little bit about the Futures Project, who I am, what we're working on. I'll begin with my personal story. So I grew up in Vermont. I look forward to growing old here too. I ended up in Vermont of all places because my parents immigrated from Southeast China back in 1986 and landed in Vermont because I have an aunt who married an American and they happen to have a home in Shelburne. Funny that's the town mentioned in the video. So that was the only social connection my parents had. Neither of them spoke English, neither of them had a college degree, but they were still able to find ways to make it work. They were able to find opportunity to put 3 boys through college and set me up for a life that they were not able to find for themselves back home in China. It's a very brave decision to leave behind everything you know to go to a new place. So I try to honor their legacy through the work of the Futures Project in pursuing answers to this mission question: how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy towards a thriving future full of opportunity for all? And it's those last 3 words that really resonate with me and motivate me because I want to make sure opportunity continues to be part of the Vermont narrative today and into the future. So how are we answering this mission question? In the moment, it's by developing a vision for Vermont's future, by creating an economic action plan. Now, you may have seen the Futures Project launched some ambitious goals last year to grow Vermont's population to 802,000 and the non-seasonal housing units to 350,000 by the year 2035. I'll get into how we landed exactly on 802. There was some personal liberty taken there. The place we need to start in thinking about where we want to go is understanding who's already here. And we can begin by taking a look at the age distribution of the current population, and it tells us quite a few narratives that we need to keep in mind. So Vermont has the lowest fertility rate in the US. Our homegrown talent supply is dwindling. We attract college students, but many of them don't stay. Ileana, I'll echo what Bruce said. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. Hopefully we can improve our retention rates because right now Vermont actually ranks dead last in terms of college graduate retention. But that to me represents an opportunity because they're here. We can see that in the data. But we need to recruit and retain more in that 25 to 49 age range, the dark green. And this is because there are about 140,000 Vermonters between the ages of 50 and 64. And over the next 10 to 15 years, many of them will exit the workforce as they retire. And when they do, they still have housing needs. And generally, as population ages, healthcare needs go up too. So by taking a look at this population pyramid, the snapshot of where we are today, it can give us a starting point for envisioning where we need to go. Now, what if we do nothing? that is a possible choice. It's not one I think we should choose, but it is a choice. I had a great conversation with a reporter from the New York Times about 5 months ago, and he was interested in what's happening here in Vermont because we are one of the oldest states. He said we are on the leading edge of what the demographic transition could mean in terms of labor force that the rest of the country will catch up to. So there's national attention on how we're thinking about the issues in Vermont and what strategies we might try, because Vermont will be a leader. We're either going to be a leader in what to do or what not to do, but one of those things will happen. And I know which one I'd rather pick. So what are some of those dangers? Dangers of doing nothing means a shrinking workforce, loss of business, declining state revenues, increased cost of living. Healthcare is going to get harder to access and more expensive. I know education's a hot topic right now. It'll continue to be as we move forward. But again, what I fear is that opportunity itself begins to fade from the Vermont narrative. So why is an economic action plan needed? Well, let's take a look at the current labor force picture. There are about 20,000 open jobs and about 7,500 job seekers. So even if everyone looking for work found a Vermont-based job, we'd still have 12,000 remaining open jobs. Now, Vermont has a lot of aspirational goals. These are all great things that I think we should aspire to try to do as a state. But when I started clicking into some of these plans, and this is not a comprehensive list, by the way, this is just what I found in a 15-minute Google search. My query was Vermont state plans. So I'm sure there are more out there, but I quickly realized we actually can't do all of these great things without an adequate supply of people and places. I'll give you an example to help bring this to life. So the Climate Action Plan, Energy Action Network in their annual report last year said that we need about 7,000 new workers doing weatherization in order for the state to meet its Climate Action Plan goals. And I just mentioned there are only about 7,500 people total in the state looking for work. We can train them all to enter the climate economy and do weatherization, and we'd get one of these plans done, but we'd run out of people to do all the other things. We wouldn't have anyone left over to be teachers, nurses, firefighters, no one to install broadband, work in the agricultural sector. We'd simply run out of people, right? When we talk about a workforce shortage, we're talking about a people shortage. Now, I mentioned the current labor force picture, but let's take a look at what that looks like moving forward. So on the supply side, the big number there, the high school grads, there were only 5,300 total 12th grade students in the entire state last year. And on the demand side, so the Vermont Department of Labor projects about 15,000 retirements per year through the end of this decade alone. So those two numbers don't balance out. And when we factor in some of these other pieces like college graduate retention, in and out migration, the demands from the business community as new jobs are created, as businesses try to grow, we see that on an annual basis, it's about a 13,500 people gap. And then when we project that forward to 2035, the numbers get in the 800,000 range. And I mentioned I took the personal liberty of picking 802 because what I found is 800,000 sounds big and scary to a lot of Vermonters. But 802, for some reason, just feels a little bit more comfortable and familiar. I'm not sure why. So I've been talking about population growth from an economic perspective, but we know that a thriving future for Vermont balances the economy, the environment, and equity. So I want to take a look at the equity perspective quickly. And this is the current picture in terms of racial and ethnic composition of our population. Vermont is about 92% white. Compare that to the US, which is about 59%. The US Census Bureau estimates that by about 2045, the country will be majority minority. And if we just go off of current rates, Vermont would definitely not reach that by 2045. So I'm going to simplify the math here a bit, right? 92% white. Let's say 9 out of 10 Vermonters are white. There are only two ways to change that ratio if we want to try to change it. We can do that through addition or subtraction. And subtraction doesn't help our workforce issue. And I also don't want to be responsible for picking who gets kicked out. So my vote is addition. Hopefully yours is too, but we can discuss that in the Q&A. When we take a look at labor force participation rates by race and ethnicity, we can see that the future is sort of kind of already here. If we think about the workforce of the future for our country, it's going to be more diverse than previous generations. And we see that labor force participation among many non-white categories in Vermont is higher than the state average. And then I want to share some information here from the Federal Reserve. They ran a simulation to try to estimate what would the economic impact of closing racial gaps in the labor market be. They did this for every single state in the country. And the estimate for Vermont is that $150 million in GDP was lost annually between 2005 and 2019. And I hope we don't continue losing that moving forward. So from an economic perspective and from an equity perspective, we can see Vermont needs more people. There's also another part of the story we should be telling, which is more people need Vermont. And we can think about that through an environmental lens. I mentioned the climate action plan earlier. Forgot to say earlier in my intro that I was an environmental studies major at Middlebury College. And when I think about environmental issues, it's important to take a step back and realize climate change is a global phenomenon. The climate doesn't end at the borders of Vermont, which is why this language that I've highlighted really stands out to me in our climate action plan. It says Vermont will need to prioritize helping the people who will be most affected by climate change. Certainly within the state, there will be differential impacts, often along socioeconomic lines. But the people who will be most affected by climate change, many of them don't live in Vermont yet. We zoom out and just take a look at the national picture for climate vulnerability. The darker areas on this map are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than the lighter areas on the map. And we can see that Vermont, relatively speaking, is positioned to do quite well. It's much more favorable in terms of its vulnerability to climate change than many other parts of the country. So there could be people seeking a place like Vermont, and I hope that they find viable pathways to one day be able to call themselves a Vermonter too. To make that possible, we have to talk about housing, right? I hear this phrase all the time, housing is a human right. And if that's the case, then it should be right to build housing. And doing so would actually help our state move forward in terms of our climate goals too. This is the greenhouse gas emissions portfolio of our state, and we see the two largest contributors, the orange and the green, represent thermal and transportation emissions respectively. Now, new construction, new homes can help to address both of those things by using smart growth principles and thinking about denser communities that are walkable. We can reduce that greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. And then on the thermal front, we know that many of the homes in Vermont are quite old. They're not thermally efficient. 25% of homes were built before 1940. The rate of new construction throughout the past few decades, we can see that Vermont used to construct new houses at a pretty fast rate. But that's dropped precipitously in recent decades. We can also use data to dispel some of the myths that are out there. I hear sometimes this idea that the pandemic has caused this acute housing shortage we're experiencing in Vermont, but that's not the case. We saw a 50% decline in active listings between 2016 and 2020 before the pandemic. And then COVID just accelerated a trend that was already underway. Much like many other things, COVID just added gas to the fire. So I want to wrap up here with a few slides on public sentiment. So, right, there's the data that we looked at, but how do people feel about things? This is a question that the Futures Project put in the Vermonter poll a couple of years ago, asking, are you supportive of growing Vermont's population size to strengthen its workforce? More people say yes than no. But what I found really interesting is when I started digging into this by age. So I'll be totally transparent. I went into this with my own bias. I thought that younger Vermonters would be more open to the idea of population growth, of new people coming here from other places, but it was the exact opposite. So the youngest respondents said no at the highest rate.
Oh
And
my
then
God.
best responses increased with each age cohort. And then I started reading the open-ended responses that went with the yes/no answers, and it became very obvious why the results played out the way they did. So the youngest respondents saw population growth as competition. They were answering from a scarcity framework. They saw it as competition in the housing market. Older Vermonters are more likely to own a home, so they're insulated from some of that market pressure. Younger Vermonters saw population growth as competition in the labor market. And then older Vermonters, in their open responses, were more likely to talk about things like healthcare and services in their communities as they age. So it's just an interesting dynamic at play. I'm going to be asking this same question again in this year's edition of the Vermonter poll to see if sentiment has changed. And then I also wanted to share this from Vermont Public. They asked in a poll that they ran, what advice would you give to an 18-year-old considering where to build a successful life and career? And 42% of respondents said leave Vermont. This might have made sense a decade ago, because a decade ago there were 2 job seekers for every 1 open job in Vermont. There were more people looking for work than work available. And today it's 3 to 1 the other way. There are 3 open jobs for every 1 job seeker, but the narrative hasn't changed. We keep telling our young people they have to go elsewhere to be successful. And it brings me back to that first question I asked, is who is Vermont for? Right. So when we launched these goals, this was just meant to be a starting point for conversation. This was not meant to be prescriptive by any means. And there was some pushback. I knew right away that not everyone was going to agree, and that's okay. You don't have to agree on these long-term targets. But what we do have to agree on is this picture. We have to agree on the underlying data. We have to agree on who's already here, and then what are the implications of that, and use this as a starting point to plan for the future. Now, when developing an economic action plan and that vision for Vermont's future, these are just a few things that I keep in mind on a regular basis. I don't think it should be a hot take, but sometimes it feels like it is. I see people as an asset and not a burden. They add productive capacity to our communities and contribute to the vitality of our communities and bring culture with them. And we can look at data to estimate how many people we might need and then plan accordingly in terms of housing too. And I feel if we can establish a collective goal or even a ballpark range that's directionally correct, it'll really help with the solution-seeking conversation as well. So here are some ways that you can help if you want to stay connected. My contact information is on the next slide. I'll also put it in the chat. But I just urge people to have data-informed discussions with your family, your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors, customers, elected officials, anyone who's willing to engage and listen and learn. And with that, I will open it up to Q&A. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. My quick question would be, where does Vermont Futures reside and how is it funded in effect?
Yep, great question. So the Futures Project emerged as an initiative from the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. Officially in about 2015, I joined the organization in 2022. So the Futures Project is a 501c3, and most of our funding comes from donations, mostly from the business communities, but some individuals as well. We've received a few small grants here and there over the years. But the motivation behind creating the organization, the chamber worked mostly in the policy space and recognized that policy often gets shaped by the loudest voice in the room, the opinion of the moment, and sometimes by what's trending on social media, for better or worse. That's not unique to Vermont. But they wanted to create an organization that would bring a consistent data and research voice to help inform policy conversations.
Great. So do you spend, or is there members of Vermont Futures in Montpelier working with the legislature?
So this is where the relationship with the chamber still is a primary avenue for taking this data and research into the policy arena. As a 501c3, I'm actually not allowed to do lobbying. So most of my work is focused on education. From time to time, I get called in to testify in Montpelier, sort of just to set the stage and update people on where the data are at. But in terms of using this information to then lobby and do advocacy to shape policy, that's through my relationship with the Chamber of Commerce.
Great. And how large is your cohort at the Vermont Futures?
You're looking at it. I'm the only full-time employee.
But I would imagine with your Middlebury background, you probably garner a number of enthusiastic data gatherers.
That's right. I do have a network of folks that support me, whether it's interns seasonally. I'm doing a project with a cohort of environmental studies students this semester who are working on a capstone. I also have an administrative contract set up with the chamber, so they provide some support for things like communications, accounting, all the stuff that like I wouldn't be able to do as a one-man shop. And then I rely a lot on collaboration with strategic partners around the state by topic as necessary.
And that's where we're hoping to get these young naysayers in the, we don't want any more people to decide to stay, as we had seen with Eliana, and as Bruce Drove mentioned too. So we hope that you're going to be effective in that role too. Joe, you have a question for Kevin or comment?
Yeah, maybe it's kind of a combination. And I remember looking at population data a while ago. Like I've have worked on the state long range transportation plan, one of those plans that was on your list. And I remember, there was this time, I don't know if it was like in the 40s or 50s, when Vermont's population was also kind of pointed downward. And, there was like this big shift, the interstate was built and there was kind of a back to the land movement, and it had a big impact on Vermont's population and our culture too. And so, and it was, as far as I'm concerned, really positive, and it kind of got us to this point. And just wondering, like, what do you think is the biggest obstacle? And I'm also just wondering about, I think nationally, just birth rates are down and our population is starting to stagnate nationally, not just in the Northeast anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me like what we need are more immigrants, and we need to open that door. And it's just this opportunity that's facing us. My grandparents were immigrants, in the 1920s, and they were sort of part of, helping Vermont become what it is today as well. So I guess that's my question, is like, what do you think the obstacles are to Vermont? Is it just in Vermont, or is it bigger than us?
Yeah, you're pointing at some really good data in terms of population trends on a national level. And you're right, the birth rates are declining almost everywhere. There are some states that are outliers, but immigration will become an increasingly important part of the national picture moving forward. And I hope that we're open and receptive and providing viable pathways here in Vermont as well. And then in terms of what's holding us back, I mean, it's easy to just start off in the policy and programs realm, but I'm a believer that policies and programs emerge from the underlying attitudes and behaviors of communities, which is why I'm so excited to do education type work and get in front of different audiences and share this information and have productive discussions, and keep asking some of these hard questions like, who is Vermont for? And I think that, in terms of the what's holding us back at the local level, I think there are more mechanisms in place that allow people to show up and say no than for people to show up and say yes. And sometimes we should make space for the people that might want to say yes, and value those voices just as much as the no voices.
Thank you.
I see.
I'm sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
So, Kevin, thank you for the data.
You're welcome.
Bruce Wilson, Board Director and Vermont Human Rights Commissioner. So when you open up your thing, you said there was going to be something funny. So when you depict Confederate flags, when you talk about less people that who like nobody like me on the video, when you use antics where a person look like me as a joke, how do you think that makes me feel? I'm not laughing about that. I've been in Vermont since '89, probably almost before you were born. And so, what do you think that did for me? And why did you do that? Why did you put Confederate flags in? Why are you open about that, saying people are gonna laugh about it? Why did you do that?
Well, I apologize if the impact was negative. That certainly was not my intent. I was just trying to hold up a mirror to some of the realities that exist here that sometimes we don't examine as closely as I think we should.
What do diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does that mean to you?
Yeah.
What does it mean to you?
So each of those words have a distinct meaning to me. I worked at the University of Vermont in the admissions office, recruiting for diversity and in a role specifically for that. So that was focused more on the numbers, the statistics, but we know that equity and inclusion go beyond just the ratio of people in a room or in a given place. Equity to me, I talked about that idea of opportunity for all, making sure that it's a level playing field, that everyone has a fair fighting chance. And then inclusion goes even beyond that and gets into the realm of belonging and trying to make sure that everyone feels like they're part of a group and has a voice and is a meaningful sort of contributing member of whatever the group is, of whatever size.
So I have one more thing to say, and that is on your own data, you're a person of color yourself, and so your numbers kind of fluctuate like African American numbers fluctuate within the lives of Vermont's, right? So you fit in the same categories that I fit in, or people who look like me, right? Would you agree with that? But did you say anything about that in your opening? No, but that's okay. So I've got it all out now. I'm just you heard my feelings, what I mean, about putting a Confederate flag up there. I fight real hard for to make sure that discrimination and racial all the different things you want to know about segregation, discrimination, stereotypical things are fought against for years since I've been here in Vermont. Okay, so I just want to let you know that. Thank you.
Yeah,
and thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Kevin. I really, I the call out is important because I felt the same way, and I think, Kevin, if you take that as feedback, you'll understand that it wasn't striking me as funny when the first thing I see is a Confederate flag, and it wasn't striking me as funny when it all started. And I appreciate your calling out, Bruce. It's a fair observation, and take it as feedback, Kevin. Appreciate it.
I'm taking it to heart. I appreciate the feedback, and Bruce, I'd be happy to follow up and have a separate conversation and learn from you and grow as a person. So thank you.
Would anyone else like to comment? Dana?
Yeah, I just like to provide some interesting anecdotal info as the mother of two 33-year-olds who went away to college and came back and have stayed. And it's pretty interesting. I have one who went to school in Massachusetts and who swore that she was coming home only to drop off her suitcases and she was leaving like the next day. It was a whistle stop. And she's still here 10 years later, works for a UF senator, loves Vermont, isn't going anywhere. The other one, so it was the importance of getting a good job. And it was also the importance of getting a good job for my other daughter. And she is, she has a little tiny house in Moncton, but neither of them have had any problems getting housing in Burlington whenever they've needed it. Even if they've had to shack up with people, housing has never been an issue. So they got the jobs in place. And then they've always had the housing down. And then what's interesting is the relationship thing. the relationships may take them out of state, but I don't know. They're both in relationships right now that feel solid here. So I think I've got the makings of couple children that are going to take care of me forever. Anyway, that's my perspective.
That is heartening. I have 3 children. I can attest to the fact that all 3 of them are still presently knocking on my wood, hanging out in Vermont and gainfully employed, all 3 of them. So housing is an issue with all 3 of them, but I think that they're navigating that. So these are important topics. Anyone else questions or comments for Kevin? All right, thank you, and remind you that he did include a donor plea on his site. So if you would like to get more information and research, I'm sure he'd be happy to use that towards that. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, Kevin, and we'll move on to agenda item 6.
Thank you.
Is that you, Chris?
I'll leave my contact information in the chat in case anyone wants to connect.
Thank you, thank you. So the agenda item 6, annual federal transportation funding spent in Chittenden County in the capital program. Is that you, Christine?
That is me. And I am going to pull up a presentation. All right, do we see that? Yes. Okay, awesome. Christine Ford, transportation planner with CCRPC, and I am going to talk about this long title, annual listing of projects receiving federal funds in fiscal year 2023. And we're also going to touch on the 2025 state transportation capital program. So first of all, so this is a list of projects that were funded in 2023. Obligation is just a term that is used by Federal Highway Administration to just define a process where funds are set aside for a particular project to then spend for design, right-of-way construction, obligation. So obligation just sort of happens before the phases of the project start. So it's a little bit ahead of the project, the actual spending of the project, and there was something I was going to say, but I don't recall what it was. So we do this every year. I mean, first of all, we're required to do it by Federal Highway. We're required to report on the amount of funds that were obligated within 90 days of the end of the fiscal year. The fiscal year ends September 30th, but it's also a really good way for us to look at how the money is spent over time. We're able to look at it by project use category, by towns. We'll be able to look at it by different like equity factors or anything that we want to do. We can apply to these projects in the past and just develop a good view of what's been spent in any category that we want. So it's pretty useful for that. And it's also just the end of our long planning process that really begins with our long range plans, going to planning studies, corridor studies, scoping studies, and then the end of the road is the design, right of way, and construction of the project. So it's reaching the finish line. So this is what the report looks like. It is linked on, this is just page 1 of the report. It's linked on the website. Projects are organized alphabetically by municipality and then alphabetically by projects. In this version of it, there's 3 columns of numbers. The one farthest to the left is the amount that was in the TIP when it was adopted at the beginning of the year. The middle column is the amount that was in the TIP at the end of the year after all the revisions. And then what we really care about is the column to the far right, and that's the funds that are actually obligated to the project. So you'll notice if you look at this that the numbers don't exactly match what was in the TIP. The TIP is a planning document, so they're generally not going to match exactly. In some cases where the numbers are really different, there's a note to try to explain why they're different. This first note on the first project that says funded with project OT017 modifications and overruns, that's just a comment that means that There is a regional item called modifications and overruns that's there for projects that have been completed, but they're still incurring some cost for just some final issues with the contractor or some other things. These are usually small amounts of money that are just applied to those projects. And if there's anything looking through it that any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer them. At the back of the list, there's this other report that has the same information for 23, but has a running 5-year list. And this is an interesting way to look at it. So you can just see like the progression of funding for projects over a 5-year time period. And these 5-year reports are what are on the website. The website doesn't have the individual 1-year reports, but has these 5-year reports.
So Christine, on the 5-year report and leading into, I assume, the fiscal year 2025 request, is that correct? To go to the governor, looking at fiscal 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23, and that 5-year one that you're speaking about, we go from 55 million to 38 million, 33 million, and then jump up to 71 and 82 million. Is that what it's saying through fiscal year 23, 19 through 23? That it's sort of 55, dropped down, boom, boom, and then really jumped up 70 and 80. And now this year's request is 90 million?
They're not exactly the same.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay, I'll back off and wait to hear how they're going to be different.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty much that. Yes. So just an overview. So in 23, before we get to 25, in 23, 82.5 million was spent in Chittenden County. There were 62 projects funded. Most of the money, 75%, 75.5% went to construction, the construction phase of the project. And the next 8.7 went to engineering, and then 0.6% to right-of-way. So most of the money was spent for construction, which is great, things that are getting actually built. And there was 11.5 million to transit and a 1 million allocation to the Amtrak service. I'm going to get back a minute to that 82.5 million, but first I just wanted to quickly look at what was completed in 23 or what was under construction. The projects that were under construction in 23, as we know, Champlain Parkway, Crescent Connector, the I-89 Exit 12 Stage 1, that's the work at the new northbound on-ramp and the multi-use path going under Exit 12 in Williston. Exit 16, intersection work at the Shelburne Street Roundabout and US 7 signal upgrades in Shelburne and South Burlington. Several large paving projects, US 2 Bolton Richmond, Class 1 paving in Burlington, US 7 paving Charlotte, South Burlington, and 289 paving in Essex. And then a couple of bike ped projects were under construction. Vermont 15 multi-use path Colchester to Essex was completed. The Village South sidewalk in Heinsberg was completed. And then the large US 2 bridge over I-89 is a very large bridge project, a couple of culvert projects, and then the Williston Park and Ride was completed. So this chart, back to the 82.5, this chart shows the funding over the past 10 years, the amount that was obligated in Chittenden County. What you'll notice, probably the first thing that you'll notice in the chart is the very high bars at 22 and 23. And the next thing you probably notice is how variable this is year to year. As we've discussed before, there isn't a set fiscal constraint limit for Chittenden County. It changes year by year depending on the projects that are in the program. And then those high 22, 23 really correspond with the new Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that had a lot more money coming to Vermont, and as a result, a lot more coming to Chittenden County. And we talked about those projects on the list that we talked about are really the big ones, a lot of big paving projects underway, Champlain Parkway, Exit 16, Exit 17, the Richmond Bridge are the big ones. But this chart shows the amount. This shows a longer time period, so you can really see the blue. So this shows the amount that comes to Vermont and Chittenden County. So this gives that Vermont piece as well. And And the overall bar is the amount that comes to the whole state, with the blue piece of it, the amount that comes to Chittenden County. And you'll see that even with those really high numbers in Chittenden County in 22 and 23, it's still 20%, 20.6% in 22 and 23.9% in 23. So there's still around the amount that we think is appropriate to Chittenden County. 16.3% is the average over that 10-year time period. The MTP assumes an average of 19%. So we're still sort of under the amount that should come to Chittenden County, or, you know, what we think is a fair number. Looking at it by categories, as we talked about it, one way we look at it, the highest category in this 1 year period was the new facility major roadway upgrade, because of those projects that we talked about, followed by paving. This is not really the typical funding profile that we have in Chittenden County. Typically, paving is always number one. Well, always except last year, but paving is typically where most of the money is spent, 24.5%. Transit is often the second number, and it's 17.7%. This is the period of 2014 to 2023.
Can you give us an example of transit, Christine? A transit
Well,
expenditure?
This is for all the services, and some of this is FTA funds that come directly to CCTA. Some are grants for buses that come to CCTA. I'm sorry, GMT. Showing my age here. GMT, and then the E&D service, elders and disabled service. So it's a lot of different programs that come to transit, and I can provide those to you. The rail.
No, I just was curious for one of the two of the examples from the category.
The rail, what we have here for rail are just rail grade crossings, and I should change this chart. Rail grade crossings and rail bridges. FRA funds are not shown on the tip, only rail projects that are funded by FHWA, and those are the crossings and some of the bridges. So that is it for the obligation information. If we want to just go straight into the capital program. So the capital program is similar but different than the TIP. The capital program is a budget document. It goes on the state fiscal year, July 1st to June 30th, rather than the federal fiscal year. So these charts are in the packet. Show the funding for 1 year. The capital program is also 4 years, but this just shows the 1 year funding for Chittenden County projects. And then the estimated construction year, which is in the state fiscal year. And this is organized by the programs in the capital program. So there aren't any surprises in here from our perspective. Still many paving projects happening, a few new paving projects coming on this year, 128 in Essex and Westford. I-89 is going to be paved north from Milton to St. Albans. We've got US 2 being resurfaced in South Burlington. Interstate bridges, there's several interstate bridges and renovation, and just not major, but upgrade, routine maintenance to be happening in several of the bridges. Exit 717 is the large bridge project that will be happening, and we'll be spending quite a bit of money this year. State bridges, we have several new culvert projects that have come on this year. And 10 highway bridges. The Burlington-Winooski Main Street Bridge will be a major item over the next many years. Roadway is the largest category, 28.7 million in that category. The large projects here are Champlain Parkway. Burlington has a grant to do work on Cherry Street. We've got Crescent Connector. We've got Colchester Prim West Lakeshore Drive. And then safety traffic operations. The largest one here is the Exit 16 project, which will start in state fiscal year 25. and bike ped facilities, transportation alternative grants, and a couple of rail grade crossing improvements. And then those are all projects that are called front of the book because they're in the front of the book. There's also 2 other lists of projects, the development and evaluation list and the candidate list. And those are projects that are just up and coming to spend money. And these are the projects that are on those lists and will be developed into the future. This category, traffic and safety, these are projects that were selected through the VPSP2 project prioritization process last year. So the top chart is the development and evaluation. Those are a little bit farther along. The bottom list are the candidates, which are really not far along at all. So as Chris said, 90 million, I think, was the total. So that's a large amount in the capital program. And this chart just gives the percentage of funding to Chittenden County from the capital program. So important to note that this chart is a subsection of the capital program. It's just taking projects from those categories that were listed in the table and comparing, because this capital program is funding DMV, is funding a lot of other things, transportation buildings, a lot of other things. So those are not included in this total. These are just simply the same thing. So it's an apples to apples. 10-year average here, 17.4%.
Safe to say that we're cresting now in fiscal year 25?
I don't know that we'll be I think we might have a couple more years to go because I think there's some big projects that are underway right now and are going to continue into the next couple of years.
And we certainly have Colchester exit 16.
16,
17.
16 and 17 both.
Yep. Okay.
It's interesting, Mr. Chair and Christine, that we are about 1/3 of the economy and 1/3 of the population, yet we get 1/4 or less of the transportation funding, and then that includes a big ticket item.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should be walking more and biking more, I guess, would be the answer to that. It's just peanuts instead of paving.
I'm going to stop the share, but I can go back to it if anybody wants to look at any of the slides.
I'd love to see you deliver a truckload of stuff with your bicycle, Chris.
The cargo bites are big business in denser populations. They do well. I was at New York City.
Yeah, that'll work well for Ben and Jerry's and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, we may yet see the day. Bard, go ahead.
Well, I think it does raise an interesting question, and I don't mean this to be controversial, but it's a rational question about what is an equitable or fair share wherever you live, whether you live in Caledonia County or Chittenden County. What's the right sort of metric? What's the right investment? And I recognize, and we sit on different groups, we sort of wear a hat of the group, the hat du jour. And here I might say in Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, I'd be saying, to the point that was just made, what percent of population, what percent of economy? And so I don't know what the right share is, but maybe it's more, maybe it's less.
I think there's a lot of groups that are struggling with that question right now with the transportation equity plan, and yeah.
It could be less, Bard, but probably not 10 percentage points less.
So we're underfunded or underappreciated, as you might put it, Jeff. Any other thoughts for Christine? Questions for Christine as to where all this money is coming from? I think we know where that's coming from, but where it's going to is what she's been able to outline for us.
Chris, it's not a homer perspective, okay? A good amount of the tax revenues that go to the state of Vermont that support the other parts of the state that can't meet their need come from this county. So if we're handicapping ourselves and our economic performance by not supporting our transportation infrastructure properly, it results in a smaller economic pie to be divided between the people who are at the table that need to consume it. That's the point.
Do we need more off ramps on 89, Jeff?
I will not say anything about South Burlington's experience in that regard.
Okay, fair enough. Any other thoughts from folks? Well, thank you, Christine. I appreciate your letting us in on the big picture with the many details that kaleidoscope that makes up the pieces of it. All right, so we're going to move to agenda item 7, board and committee appointments. This is an action I can take almost unilaterally. I'm going to make some announcements, and if there are any objections to these appointments, please speak up and do so as we roll through them. So I'd like to hear about them. Otherwise, by fiat, I'm going to make these appointments to our various boards and committees as follows. We're going to add a regional board member to the industrial and business sector, Austin Davis from the Lake Champlain Region Chamber of Commerce. He's the manager of government affairs there. I believe he's online with us, but we'll be appointing him to go in on as a regional member. We're going to go down to the Clean Water or the Basin 5 Water Quality Council. I had a question for Charlie on this. We have like 6 members, well, 3 members and 3 alternates. Can you give me a little more background on Basin 5 Water Quality Council's makeup? Are these 3 the only members?
Yeah, no, Chris, you're calling attention to my bad case of copy pasting. There's actually 3 basins that we're making these appointments to. Basin 5, I think, is the first row, and I apologize, and Dan can correct me. Brad and Cy are, which basin is that, Dan? Is that 7?
7, Lamoille.
And which one is for Darlene and Garrett is?
Winooski Basin.
What number is that? Basin 8?
8.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris. They should have different numbers. They are actually different basins. That was bad labeling on my part. Thank you.
So, and to translate into real terms, Basin 5 is the many tributaries feeding into the Lake Champlain that we're responsible for here in our sector.
Direct to Lake Champlain. Yep.
Okay, so direct tributaries, not the main line, Lamoille and Winooski, which are the other numbers,
the other
7 and 8. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Charlie. I'll see if I can pronounce the names.
Messing you up. Yeah, sorry.
Well, that's why I wanted to get it straight beforehand, but I didn't log on in time. So for an appointment to the Basin 5 Direct to Lake Water Quality Council, we're going to have the member Brett McCreary, and we're going to have Miles Waite as alternate. And then moving on to Lamoille Basin 7 Water Quality Council, we're going to have Brad Holden of Underhill. Thank you, Brad. And we're going to have Cy Sarapali as alternate. And then moving to the Winooski Basin 8 Water Quality Council, we're going to have Darlene Palaloa and as the main member, and Garrett Mott, thank you, Garrett, as the alternate. So moving on to the ad hoc, any objections to those appointments? We're going to the ad hoc Brownfields Advisory Committee. We're going to add Heath Kirby from the Vermont Department of Health. And then the Equity Advisory Committee, we're going to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 members. We will add Vermilla Chetri. We will add Kashka Orlo. We will add Jules Witecki. We will add Ali Castile. We'll add Coralie Katrina and Clayton Clark. Okay, hopefully I did well on pronunciation, and Nelson might be, or Bruce can correct me if I didn't well. So we'll add those members, and if there's no objections, Charlie, you're all set. Okay, then we will make it so, and we will move on to agenda item 8, draft code of conduct, and I'll hand it over to you, Ann Nelson. Very good.
It's me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm gonna share my screen. Before I do that, let me just say, one, sorry for sending this out so late last night. I do not expect you all to have meaningful time to review it in less than 24 hours. There's still a lot of language throughout this draft code of conduct that still applies to, or the wording is about employees, and it will be transferred over to, say, representatives. So today we're talking about the board version of the code of conduct. So this will be the code of conduct that will apply to you all and CCRPC committee members. For board members, it'll live with your board member handbook once it's finished. The other thing that I want to say just really quickly is you all know, or many of you know, that CCRPC is participating in the EPIC program along with other municipalities throughout the state. Many of the municipalities here are also participating. And at our last meeting, we were asked to all come to the table with an example of a what they're calling a wicked problem. So a problem that's really difficult to solve, to share with everybody. And almost everyone's group, by far the majority, came to the table with a crisis of civil discourse, of just like fear and divisiveness getting in the way of discourse within municipalities. And so from that conversation, we've been kind of reading these articles about this crisis of civil discourse in Vermont, but in the US more largely. And anyways, I just want to highlight and underline like the significance of thinking about this code of conduct and codes of conduct being very important for setting behavioral expectations and standards for ourselves and for one another in this time. So anyways, it was a kind of, I'm not surprised, though it was surprising at the same time to hear that from so many folks in that cohort. And I'm glad that we're going through this process. So I'm going to share my screen and I don't have a presentation. I'm just going to run through this draft. I'm obviously not going to read it. It's 20 pages, but I will just kind of walk through the kind of flow of the document. Feel free to stop me along the way. You don't need to raise your hand, just talk because I won't be able to see you. And we can kind of converse as needed throughout, or you can save questions and comments for the end. Okay, let me share.
The interesting thing is if you didn't read the code of conduct that Annie sent out this morning, you're in violation of the code of conduct because you're supposed to be prepared for your meeting.
I know. Well, let me tell you, I'm going to be the first one that you can hold accountable once this is adopted, because there's language in here that.
Yeah. In fact, however, the code of conduct suggests that it has to have been issued. Everything has to have been issued 5 to 7 days in advance. So,
yeah.
So it would be a duel, but
just the detail.
But I think she's done a superlative job, and we should listen to her.
Thank you, Ben. I was going to flag that and say that, yeah, I'm your #1 culprit. So I do apologize for that. And you all should be given sufficient time to actually review this content meaningfully. So I apologize for that, and we'll do better in the future. Okay. Oh, this is not. Oh, hold on 1 second.
Hey, while you're looking, and
Yes.
this is Bard, can I make a comment?
Yeah. Please.
And this is not getting into the weeds of the conversation we just had, but it's interesting to me that in my other work, my paid work, it's accepted as a fact that if we're going to be inclusive of people with disabilities, that we want to send stuff out a week in advance. That is actually considered an inclusionary practice, especially for people with intellectual or visual disabilities. And I do not at all mean that as a criticism here. It's just, as we move forward in terms of expectations, it's like a catch-22 or an irony that in fact the point of inclusion is to be further ahead in terms of release of materials.
Yeah.
For what that's worth.
Thank you, Bard. I'm actually going to include that language in that section because I think you're spot on. It is about inclusive. I mean, who has the time? The expectation should be not that you have the time 24 hours ahead of time, not even 24 hours ahead of time, to put aside whatever you're working on and read through this. Or if it might take you longer to read, or you understand things in different ways. So we really do. It's respectful and inclusionary practice to give people time in advance. So here I am. Okay, so I'm gonna work with Emma. This won't stay in just a Word document. We're gonna kind of pull it into a more visually appealing and easier to read format once it's finished. So just keep that in mind. And in the kind of on the inclusionary note, we will make sure that it's, you know, we're using the right fonts and the size of the font is accessible and that other accessibility measures are addressed throughout. So just noting that. So anyways, there's a purpose. You all have seen these, our new kind of organizational values that we've come up with. So we kind of start the document by outlining, here's our vision, here's our organizational mission. We have an equity commitment, and then we have organizational values. These values are integrity, accountability, respect, and inclusion. There are definitions or kind of an explanation of each of those values. The idea being that if we can name the values that we seek to uphold, it will support us as we think about decision-making frameworks. What projects do we partake in? How do we deal with conflict? How do we treat one another? And then this section that it used to be called behavioral expectations, and I've changed it to culture because it's very lofty. But I also think it's really important to name the culture that we aspire to and acknowledge that this is an ongoing practice. So certainly not everybody can behave in these expected ways all of the time. I don't. Instead, we want to be able to look to them and say, we hope to do that. Can we help hold each other accountable to that? And that in and of itself, I think is actually a really beautiful form of respect to say, like, actually, I believe that you can do better. I believe that I can do better. Can we open up the space to think about how we can do better and constantly look to how we hope to be better? So there's a list underneath each of these values of kind of general behaviors that we have named that kind of speak to that value. So, you know, under integrity, it's anything from thinking regionally while acting locally, keeping, you know, larger systems in mind. We approach our work as critical problem solvers. We prioritize quality over quantity, saying yes when we have time and resources. Down in accountability, we share relevant information through accessible and comprehensible, clear communication. We're honest. We set explicit goals so that we can monitor and evaluate the impact of our projects. We innovate when appropriate and where we can. We take risks if necessary to better serve Chittenden County communities. Respect. We choose our words carefully. We trust and share credit with one another. We celebrate the successes of others, not just within the workplace, but also beyond. We recognize that we have lives outside of the work that we do. Inclusion. We welcome everyone in the work that we do. We strive to be attuned to the needs of the communities we serve. We build time into projects to allow for collaboration and reflection. We remove barriers to participation, so on and so forth. Charlie's in here. Okay, so under additional expectations, obviously in the staff version, this is where we've got like hours of work and also dress code and vehicle use, things like that. For board and committee members, here's what we have, and I've pulled this content or some of this content from the existing board member handbook. So the first one is meeting attendance, which is, you know, we encourage folks to attend as many meetings as possible. We also understand that life is dynamic and unforeseen circumstances arise. Please communicate in advance. Preparedness for meetings. This is where you can point your finger at me. Preparation is essential for productive meetings. So material should be sent at least 5 to 7 days prior to the meeting. Board members are expected to review the board packet ahead of time, come ready with questions, thoughts, so on and so forth. Dress code, this is I was like, should we include this in the board committee version? But I'm leaving it here because we still have in-person events. And And this is the language generally that's in the staff version. So we're balancing comfort with organizational objectives. We're expected to dress in a neat, professional, business casual attire that's suitable for the workplace and interaction with the public. We also respect that this may look different for different folks of different cultures and religions. So we also accommodate those individual preferences within the bounds of professionalism. And then communication with your local legislative body. So in order for us to do our job appropriately as a regional planning commission, we need to be informed, and we rely on you all and other connections we have through committees to understand what's going on in different localities across the region. So communicating back and forth is really imperative. So language about that, and committee members as well, communicating with their other affiliations so that we can collaborate and coordinate efforts where possible and share resources so that we're not reinventing the wheel. Okay, so that's kind of expectations. Here's what we aspire to. And then there's a section with unacceptable behavior. I actually have not touched this conflict of interest language because it's pulled directly from our bylaws. But essentially stating that there can't be any conflicts of interest.
Anne?
Yes.
And Ben Bornstein here, if I may.
Yeah.
I find that interesting because I think just a superlative job in updating many things and including numerous to try to cover more specifically various areas that in the past have been left out. But in looking specifically in conflict of interest, there does seem to be a need perhaps to visit, and I'm glad to work with you. It's the idea of personal benefit or gain versus a matter of private interest. In other words, the actual legal definition and under federal law, it has a lot to do with not only that a real conflict of interest exists when a private interest leads to a personal benefit or gain, but what's happening here in this language, it seems to sublimate or blur the distinction that it's not merely where there's a matter of personal benefit or gain, but in fact where private or personal interests, not just a personal benefit or gain, personal interest could be considered to be a benefit if pursued. But in fact, it's a broader, and also in many cases, especially where it comes to impacting on workplace environment, harassment and the like, especially in some of the more recent cases where women have been harassed or their positions have been, and professionalism have been, attempts have been made to compromise it. It's where private interests and to achieve a level to show a standard of private gain, it's very difficult, and this would mount essentially a much higher bar than I think is the intention. It's something I would suggest we need to examine to ensure that people are protected and that we aren't somehow losing losing part of the definition that in turn would have a supremely adverse impact on legitimate need to raise issues in the workplace, for example.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I do hear that, and I feel the same way. This feels, it's really outdated. It's confusing. It's not clear to read. I want to make the language a little bit clearer and address the issue that you just brought up. So yeah, let's chat. The conflict of interest section in the staff version of the Code of Conduct, I've kind of organized more neatly into different forms of conflict of interest. And I think something similar here also makes sense. So yeah, we'll revise this section.
Yeah, I'll be back up in Vermont in just a week, and I would be glad to for quite some time. So I'll be glad to meet with whomever, with you, and just to sit down. We could, go over it if you'd like, and if others, of course, not to exclude anyone, but would be glad to sit and work with you on it. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, that would be great. I can pick your legally trained brain. Yeah,
to
sorry,
think
Chris.
on what Benjamin had said, the piece that certainly is true in South Burlington's code of interest, code of conflict of interest language is the appearance as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, and I don't necessarily see that jumping out at me in this section. So, you know, it's one of those
Yeah.
things where you're asked to recuse yourself or at least explain something that relates to even the appearance of a personal gain or benefit. So I agree with what he said and would just add
Yeah.
that thought that the appearance is important as well, and that people should be required to address that. Unfortunately, you know, a lot of our conflict of interest policies at the municipal level have no real enforceable actions to them. So one can just say, well, I might appear that way, but it's my conscience is clear. So I don't know how to insert that without getting too wordy. Thank you, Benjamin.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Next in this section, I have a note on partisan political activity and nonpartisan political activity. Both of these are new sections as well, and I think were and are deserving of clarity. And so CCRPC staff members, because we're public employees, we're covered under the Hatch Act, which is an act that protects civil servants from participating in partisan political activity while at work or representing the organization. But it goes a little bit further than that because we are civil servants and we need to keep our work nonpartisan. However, board and committee members are not employed by CCRPC, so they're not covered under the Hatch Act. That being said, I think there still ought to be an expectation that board members and committee members do not participate in partisan political activity while representing CCRPC. So certainly you're allowed to do so in your own time, in your other jobs, whatever it might be. But when you're acting as a board member or a committee member of CCRPC, we cannot participate in partisan political activity. So there's some examples that I've included there. That language, most of that language comes from the Hatch Act. And then a note on nonpartisan political activity. Obviously, this is fuzzy. We all have rights to free speech. However, the organization also has an obligation to protect its reputation. And so the language here is really like, use your own discretion. Regional planning is a political activity. Much of what we do could be deemed political. It is political. However, the organization sanctions certain views and it doesn't say anything or doesn't sanction other views. And so we have to be mindful as when we're representing CCRPC, the stance we're taking on issues. In our own lives, we're allowed to do what we may, participate in, whatever political activity we might want to. However, if there is the legal language, I think, would be a significant nexus to the work we do or to the organization, then that activity could impact somebody's ability to work. And that's when it becomes an issue. And then we need to address that as such. So there's some language in here. Feel free to read it over. That's just kind of about that. Using your own judgment and not engaging in political activity as a representative of CCRPC unless it's been kind of sanctioned and approved by the organization. So for example, something that might be in our ECOS plan or a stance that the organization has taken before. Okay, and then there's legal language on harassment and discrimination. This came from an HR consultant that we worked with who updated this language. These are federal requirements. So there's we've tried to make it a little clearer and straightforward, like what counts as discrimination, what counts as harassment. There is both sexual harassment. There's also other forms of unlawful harassment. What are examples of both of those? The lines are still blurry, but again, like really focusing here on, okay, as soon as there might be an issue, as soon as there might be a feeling that you're starting to cross a line or somebody else's, can we address it then and there? And can we start to do that through dialogue? A note on reporting unlawful harassment. This section is separate from our own kind of conflict resolution process because there are some legal requirements that come with reporting unlawful discrimination or harassment. So that's why this section is a bit different. Okay, a note on alcohol and substance use, drug use on CCRPC property or while at work or engaged in CCRPC work. And then there is a shortened list of other examples of unacceptable behavior. I've tried to focus here on like serious, most of this is unlawful behavior and not try to get into laundry listing all the behavior that we don't want to see at CCRPC. Instead, the focus is on what we're striving to do, how we're striving to behave. All of that's listed up front. As conflict arises or as harm may occur, dealing with it, and then really naming like, okay, these forms of unacceptable behavior are so extreme that they might actually bypass any restorative process, any form of managing the conflict internally or through dialogue, and instead necessitate disciplinary action. So the next section is on, we've covered behavior, how we're hoping to behave, behavior that's not allowed, and now implementation of this code of conduct. Maybe this should live at the end now that I'm thinking about it, but assigned acknowledgement of receipt and review. So when you become a board member or committee member, you will receive a copy of this, review it, and sign it anytime it's revised. And then every year you will be given a copy to review and to sign. It will also be a part of onboarding and training, orientation. So for new board members or new committee members, whoever is onboarding that person or those new people will also be responsible of walking through this document to make sure that it's clear, folks know where to find it, they know how to navigate it, they understand the meaning of the content in here. A practicing of regular recognition and feedback. So this is a new kind of element here. How can we build time into meetings? How can we, when designing agendas, when thinking about the annual flow of meetings, are there times that we can build in for recognition and feedback? What's going well? What challenges have we faced? Can we give feedback to one another, to those leading the meetings, to those participating, to the structure, to CCRPC staff members, vice versa? Again, of just practicing talking through like what might not be going well. Education and training. So board members, for example, might be asked to participate in a training around conflict resolution or some other piece or parcel of this code of conduct. And then a piece about public meetings and the importance of ground rules. So starting to practice naming ground rules in meetings that are open to the public. I can't even count on my hands the number of meetings that I've either witnessed since moving to, it's not just Vermont, in Virginia too, but since being here, city council meetings, select board meetings, other forms of public meetings where, there's anger, there's conflict, there's divisiveness, and ground rules I really do think are a really helpful tool to at least start to address the culture of public meetings. Okay. And then we get into this kind of conflict resolution piece. So there's an overall section that's about a restorative approach to conflict resolution, just some information. What is restorative justice? How does it differ from kind of traditional forms of justice, especially within the workplace? What does a restorative justice approach to conflict resolution look like? Typically, it involves these key steps. There's preparation and engagement, and then there's a facilitated dialogue. It may be a series of dialogues. It might just be one. It could involve, if there's a conflict between me and Charlie, it could just involve me and Charlie, or it could involve a third-party facilitator, whether that's a member of the executive committee or whether that's somebody we're bringing in externally from the Community Justice Center. In that dialogue, there's a sharing of perspectives, and there's kind of templates for how to walk through this. It does seem forced sometimes, but I do think it's really productive and helpful. There's a taking responsibility, making amends, and follow-up. A section on when to use this approach. Certainly there are forms of harm and conflict that where this approach makes sense, and then there may be some when it doesn't make sense. It's always voluntary. If anybody involved in the conflict or harm does not want to engage in a restorative approach, then that's their right, and we wouldn't use this approach. It's completely voluntary, so everybody needs to be willing. And then it breaks down the actual kind of process. So what happens when conflict occurs? And this was a big, we did a all staff training around harassment and discrimination and our kind of existing personnel policy. And a lot of the feedback we received was around this. Like, I don't really understand what to do if there's conflict that doesn't count as harassment or discrimination, right? It's not that extreme. And 95, maybe more % of the conflict that happens certainly doesn't fall in that category, right? It could be as little as like, I don't know, the way some tiny thing that Charlie's doing that's annoying me over time that I would like to address, but I don't know how. So step 1, if possible, address directly. We'll share resources to do so. The Community Justice Center has kind of helped build out a few resources for how to have these conversations. They're not easy. And if you don't want to address it directly, then please report it. So there's a section on who do I report to. Obviously, this looks different in the board and committee version than it does in the staff version. It's a little confusing in this format, but we will pull it into a graphic that will be easier to read. So if there's a conflict between a board member or a committee member and CCRPC staff member, then you would report it to the executive director. If there's conflict between, a staff member has a complaint about a board member or a committee member, they would report it to the executive committee, so on and so forth. And it's important here too to keep options open for people. So somebody might not be comfortable in the staff version, for example, it's here too. If you don't feel comfortable reporting directly to a member of the executive committee, please report to a CCRPC supervisor or the executive director, and they can do so for you. So opening up options for people in case they don't feel comfortable reporting to certain folks. Yeah, Ben, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. One other item. It's a little unclear to me with respect to the interaction or the interplay between this type of a situation and the filing and the timeline or due process outlined for grievances.
Yeah.
Because I can imagine where people are in good faith trying to approach and discuss and try to alleviate the situation or come to some direct remedy, which is of course always preferable, but it could drag on. And where the report, the grieved shall put forth, this is a little further on, shall put the grievance in writing, providing copy executive director within 30 working days of the action that is the basis of the grievance or the employee's knowledge of its occurrence. Is that, are we totally separate from this situation, or is that also a category of this process?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for bringing that up. We're actually going to update that grievance procedure. That language is pulled straight from our personnel policy and has been the same. I haven't touched it because I was worried that I couldn't change it. And after meeting with this HR consultant, who's also a lawyer, he was like, no, we need to change this language. It's not clear and it's outdated. So that we're actually going to update that process. But it will be important, and it will be in here around setting some kind of expectation for when a conflict needs to be addressed, right? If somebody brings something up, it needs to be a priority for that to be addressed and not just continually drag on or for them to be able to put it off. So that language does need to be in here. It might be slightly different for a grievance than it is for a harm or some kind of conflict that's going through this restorative process.
I guess my major concern is that where if there can be some clarity as to when I hate to use the analogy, but the trigger event or the trigger time is, so that people of goodwill who are really trying to make it work or trying to work it out among themselves or between themselves, that they know that, okay, they're now being purposely misled or dragged, that not everyone is of goodwill. And simply, I don't want to take too much time on this, but you know, that's a critical thing to perhaps maybe drill down or to focus reworking in trying to identify what that trigger event or how to identify that for everyone concerned and facilitate then the process. So.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
You bet.
Just writing that down. Okay. Okay, so you've reported an incident. Here's who you report to. The next step is investigation and determining next steps. So what happened? When did it happen? How did it make people feel? What impact did it have on others? You know, what issue are we dealing with? And the determining next steps, this is really where you would figure out, like, okay, do all involved parties want to work through this internally through dialogue using these restorative resources that we will have access to? Or actually, is this conflict so great, or is the harm too great that one or more parties are not willing to do that? And we either want to bring in an external facilitator, or we're just going to go through a formal resolution process and not engage in a restorative process at all. That could happen, though. I hope that there's some dialogue. But this is where that would be decided, and this needs to be a collaborative decision, right? So all involved parties need to have a say here. Certainly, you can only go through a restorative process if all involved parties are willing to do so. But the responsible party for at least overseeing this process would be the person that it's reported to. So in this document for everybody, it would either be the executive director or the executive committee. There's some information about third-party facilitation. So both the Burlington Community Justice Center and the Essex Community Justice Center have stated that they're willing to be listed here as resources, contacted, and we can bring them in to offer third-party facilitation. So step 3, you either kind of follow the restorative process or the formal conflict resolution process, depending on the conflict. And I kind of break down the steps here for both. So there's an internally facilitated restorative process with some resources that in this version, I think I'll attach as appendices. And then a formal process. And the formal process is really, as it has been in the personnel policy, the overseer, the responsible overseer, determines what disciplinary measures are appropriate for that situation. So in the case of a board or a committee member, it might be an oral or written warning. Those get documented and signed. It might be, you know, training or education. It could be suspension or requested resignation from the board or the committee. And then there's the grievance procedure, as Ben mentioned. This, as I said, is going to be updated. The language is the same as it has been, and it's very formal and a bit confusing. But that's if somebody has a grievance against or towards the organization itself. So they believe that they have been wronged in some way by CCRPC, and they go through a grievance procedure.
And Nelson, it's by a decision of CCRPC. So it kind of follows, like if I didn't follow through on the complaint, but I also am not sure if it's relevant at all to our board and committee members. Yeah, because it's still in our personnel manual and it needs to be updated, but it's really for staff, I think. So I don't know.
I was going to ask that would there be a situation where a board member or committee member would be involved in a grievance procedure?
Hard for me to imagine, but you know, the exec committee can just fire me if they're not happy with the way I did it. So.
Okay.
Very good.
And then, and then there will be, you know, a series of appendices. So I'll have some additional resources that I've leaned on to kind of create this document and to provide some more information on content that's in here. There will be restorative justice resources accessible to everybody and training and education that may come along with that. But that's that. I would welcome any thoughts. You don't have to share them now. Feel free to email me or give me a call. I'm happy to meet, kind of walk through this. I will send out an updated version. I know the version that I sent you, some of the language is still needs to be tweaked. But it does provide, you know, kind of a general overview of what's here. So feel free to use that. Or I'll send an updated version as soon as I can.
Any comments and questions are definitely welcome.
Yeah, please. And for those who have reached out with comments, I really, really appreciate it. This has been a crowdsourced effort. Yeah, Dana.
Yeah, Ann Nelson, nice job. It's really coming along. Up to unacceptable behaviors, you have a bullet point on public disclosure of private information. I was just wanting some clarity around what that means.
That's
What
under
are the
unacceptable
standards
behaviors
around that?
Yeah. I think that's language that was also in the previous one, and it's public disclosure of private information. Is that what it says?
Something like that.
I took it as understanding like we, you know, information we don't disclose information here beyond the boundaries of CCRPC, but maybe that's not what it means, and I will clarify.
I was just wondering.
Let me pull it up.
And
Yeah.
that could be, or if it's in meetings or
Let me see,
around
'cause
the
it's-
office.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are very few occasions we have some confidential things, like we're dealing with the communications union district right now, where there's kind of a confidential proposal from one of the broadband providers. Yeah, so there are some limited things that aren't subject to open meeting law, but I don't know if that's exactly what that's referring to. The other thing that comes to mind is HIPAA, you know, but
right.
You know, those
it might not
don't
be
usually
super
come up here
relevant.
either.
Yeah, I mean, there may be things that relate to personnel issues that don't need to be bandied about in the public where you're a representative of CCRPC as a board member, but you're talking about some inside knowledge you have related to an individual that, you know, that's not fair for sure. And under the same guidelines as HIPAA, and which would be health related about an individual and their absence or otherwise. I mean, we're really constrained in this day and age to, you know, explain some of these absence for health reasons, you know, well, what do they got? What's wrong? You know, and it's a common human issue, but I think we can't speak to that as much as we might have been able to 30 years ago. So those would be examples I can think of.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out, Dana. I do think they might live better in the kind of front of the document, as you know, we aspire to respect confidentiality rather than the unacceptable behavior. At the very least, I will clarify the language. So thank you.
Great.
Anyone else with thoughts on the present draft? And go ahead, Jeff.
I'm all half reluctant to say this. Because it's not a reflection on the stuff that Ann and the staff have done. But I would hope that this reflects the fact that we are all volunteers. We are appointed by our communities, by our legislative bodies, and we sign up for this because we love our communities and we really love the organization. I kind of felt like I was half being scolded by some of this stuff. And I would hope that the final draft will reflect the fact that most of us here are volunteers and we're here because we want to be. And if we really have problems with another member or something like that, that in at least my 24 years on this organization, we've dealt with it amongst ourselves. Okay. And that I just don't want us to go overboard on this. And I kind of got the feeling that, you know, if I was a paid employee, that about a third of this applied to a paid employee, but maybe wasn't appropriate for a volunteer. And I just do that because I want to see the pendulum swing back a little bit to recognize the nature of the people who are part of this organization that this is intended to cover as board members.
So this is Bard. For the last section, I had some similar thoughts, and I'm sorry I didn't actually get through that earlier in terms of my other comments. But I was struck that it's an awkward transposition to just take the employee language and do a find and replace to representative. And I was just here tonight thinking, so since we're appointed, Jeff's point, appointed by another body, that's a different kind of authority than an employee. And then I kept going. I started thinking, oh, like the behavior of, say, a member of Congress or a presidential candidate, that there are a whole bunch of things that we might consider inappropriate, but those people don't fall into the sort of funnel of employee guidelines, behaviors, modifications. And that's not very clear. It's sort of a conceptual thing. And so it's really half formed, but I'm thinking that some of the things that apply to employees very clearly, and I've seen this in various places, town, state, etc., are more awkward when it's voluntary members of a board who are appointed by a local legislative body. And it's not very articulate, but I think that there is a different scope, and I think that's kind of what Jeff was suggesting.
So hearing the two of you, and I'm sorry to jump in here, Ann Nelson, it would, and I'll get to Andy in a minute, Andy Watson-Williston. It sounds like, a softening of the language, or maybe a shortening of the language to customize it more towards the appointed members. But Andy, go ahead. I didn't know if you were agreeing or you.
No, yeah, I agree with what Bard said. I think that maybe just to add on to that, the remedy, I think, for an appointed for an issue with an appointed board member from a municipality would be for I think the body to go to the appointing agency or the appointing board, like the select board of the town. Like if there was an issue with me or with someone else, that it was not able to be something that could be easily addressed. Perhaps, as Jeff was talking about a moment ago, that it would be a matter that would be taken to the appointing agency, or I keep saying agency, the appointing the board, rather than dealt with through the executive director. It would be more because we serve at the pleasure of the town that's appointing us, right? Kind of like that, like Bard's reference to Congress. We serve at the pleasure of the body that sends us here.
Yeah. Thank you all. I mean, you all are picking up on the fact that this is the content was pulled from the staff version, and then I'm trying to kind of tweak it, and I haven't gotten far enough along in that process. So that is I think you all are right about that. It's too long and the language needs to be softened, and there needs to be more like acknowledgement of, you all are here as volunteers because you want to be here, and clarifying your role as it compares to a staff member, and then kind of, making sure that tone is consistent throughout. So I hear that, and we'll work on that. And then as for go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just trying to camp on to what Andy and Jeff and Bart had said, and I think I had my piece. I always look for individual wordsmithing. I come from a world where it was, we will strive to, we will endeavor to, and when we're working towards softening the language. But as Andy pointed out, less may be more, and just point towards the legislative body that appointed you, or the governing body that appointed you, and say, if there's a problem, we're going to this person. So it's almost as if we should just maybe be able to pull out a smaller version of what we have here. Are we seeing here the entire board's draft?
Yeah.
Okay, so shortening it would probably be in the best interests of our busy lives too.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
other thoughts?
Yeah, I hear
there
that.
are also occasionally pretty energetic differences on policy that aren't personal, but can result in some pretty energetic policy disagreements. So I don't, you know, I was, when I was reading it, Annie, and again, it's not being critical, I was sitting here thinking, what if this policy was in place during our debates over the Cirque Highway? And maybe Garrett would remember when we used to have those in Catherine. And, you know, there was real
animosity?
No, it wasn't animosity, but it
Conflicting
may have been
views.
more Virginia-like, Anne, you know, in terms of the discussion.
Yeah.
That you will probably see 99.9% of the time from this organization.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, it's hard to know where to draw the line where there's a real conflict versus one that's a real conflict, but it's not personal. And I think our manual is more towards personal or, you know, maybe, you know, viewpoint as to whether you're male or female or part of some ethnic group or something like that. And I think you have the impossible task of trying to distinguish between those kinds of things. And I would rather have you take a long time and thoroughly think them through, because as one who's going to be working on the bylaws, I can see multiple citations of our code of conduct being put into the bylaws. And before we do something like that, we have to be absolutely certain of our code of conduct. And I think all these things are kind of coming together all at the same time. And you have a nearly impossible job. It's like being Commissioner of Economic Development in Vermont.
Yeah.
So this is Bart. I was just gonna maybe try to close it by saying, as I listen and my wheels are slowly turning, that perhaps the guidance here is more similar to guidance to like members of Congress. They come together separately. We come together separately, appointed by our boards. And it's more about the decorum of that than it is the employee guidelines. As a long-term employee of the executive branch in state government, there are certain policies. It doesn't matter what I think about it. The policy is set by a governor, secretary, legislator, commissioner. When we come here, though, we have more of a free hand, and we are more like members of Congress, I think, trying to represent our communities and policy decisions about which we may disagree.
Yeah.
And the only last thing I mentioned, Ann, is we have certain federal procedures in our MPO work that dictate how things are done and considered and voted on, you know, and those kinds of things. And we got to just make sure that we don't put anything in here that isn't sensitive to that. And I think, I'm not sure, I can't remember because I'm getting old. I think even operating our board meetings, it's in the bylaws that they're done by Robert's rules.
Mm-hmm.
So we just need to make sure that we don't inadvertently change something. And I think that we do that because some of us used to be or are currently on select boards. And that's probably the best way to run a meeting with those objectives in mind and our work plan in mind, and then structuring public input, which I know sometimes isn't as sensitive as it should be to getting all viewpoints. But I think we can, you know, make adjustments to the way that we operate under Robert's rules in order to make sure that that happens without necessarily getting overly prescriptive in our code of conduct.
Yeah.
That would, after getting this morning and spending a couple hours reading it this morning and things like that, those were the only things that struck me about this. And, you know, as someone who's been on the board in various capacities since 2001.
Thanks, Jeff. No, I appreciate you bringing that up. It is really helpful. So we will go back, keep working. You're right. Let's go slow. Let's get it right and feel comfortable with where it is. And also the one other thing I want to say is that I think a lot of the content that's in this document, to I think your point, you all already do, right? We all already do. And so I definitely don't want this document to feel like it's scolding. So the tone really, that is not the goal. And it is stating a lot of what we're already doing in our relationships with one another as a group. You know, we're engaging in forms of restorative conversations all the time. As you know, little bits of harm happen, we repair. Conflict occurs, we repair. There's disagreements, we move forward. And so, some of it is stating what we already do a really good job of, and what you all already do a really good job of. So, anyways, thank you for all that feedback. We'll keep working.
No, thank you. With leave of everybody else, we'll move on to agenda item 9, the equity update, and we will stay with you for that, Ann Nelson.
More of me. Okay, let me just quickly share this slide so you can see what I'm saying and I'm not just talking at you. Code of conduct, obviously been working on this in collaboration with staff. The creative discourse reviewed it, and community justice centers, and the HR consultant that we've been working with. The Equity Advisory Committee still up and running. We meet once a month. This photo here is from our January meeting on the 31st, where we partnered with the state's Climate Action Office to do some engagement around climate action. So we had, I think, 50 people in CCRPC's main conference room, and 4 different languages spoken. We had dinner, and we broke out into smaller focus groups to discuss climate action. That feedback will all feed into the state's update of their climate action plan. It will also feed into our regional plan update. So that was a super successful meeting. We got a lot of great feedback. Some folks walked away and said that it was the most diverse room they had ever seen in Vermont. So that was really, really awesome to have all those people in a room together. We are still looking for another board member to join the Equity Advisory Committee for 2024. So if you're interested, please let me know. And then this next meeting, the next EAC meeting, which is next week, we're going to do some kind of strategic planning for the year. Other work, CCRPC is participating in the EPIC program, as I mentioned.
Can you give us a quick synopsis of EPIC for those who aren't familiar with the acronym and how it's new?
Yeah, the acronym is very confusing. It's the Ethical Performance Improvement Campaign, and it's led by the Vermont League of Cities and Towns in partnership with a consulting firm called Abundant Sun, which is led by Jude Smith-Rakelly. And it's kind of a, honestly, it really overlaps a lot with this code of conduct. I think her being Jude's whole approach to equity work, generally speaking, is that we need to focus on the cultures we're cultivating internally within our municipalities, within our organization. So how can we start to do that?
And with the reach of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, it's in effect covering a lot of the cities and towns in Vermont, right?
Correct. Yeah. So there was a cohort that went through last year. This is the second cohort with different cities and towns participating. And this is the first year, or the first time they're opening it up to regional planning commissions. So Lamoille County Regional Planning Commission, I think, is participating, and CCRPC.
Thank you.
So that's been great.
Good.
And then lastly, ECOS plan. We're in the process of updating the ECOS plan. So I've been working with Taylor and Darren and Sarah and Melanie and other folks to kind of design and start to do outreach and engagement for that plans update. So today I was at King Street Laundry, which is a laundromat in Burlington, for a couple hours talking to some houseless folks about health, and we have some other events planned. So that's what I've been doing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the update, and I appreciate the work on the draft code of conduct so far. It, as Jeff has pointed out, is a Herculean task and may require more massaging until we feel it's customized to our needs. But thank you, and I'm sorry it's going to take longer, of course, but we would like to get it right, and I think you're getting targeted in on it. So I'm going to move to agenda item 10, unless anybody, I'm sorry, anybody have any further questions on the equity update for Ann Nelson? Hearing and seeing none, I'll move on to Charlie for executive director's updates. I do not have any myself.
Thanks, Chris. So just a few items. I'll be quick. I'm conscious of the time and apologies for overpacking this agenda, but thank you for all your engagement on the topics. Number one is we had some discussion at the executive committee. If you want a little bit more detail, check those minutes, but short story is that we're going to try experimenting the next couple months with using the AI summary and trying to get to a little, you may have noticed that when you logged in, there probably was a little note about AI summary tool, or Emma, tell me, you can remind me what the actual name is, but so we're trying to see if we can reduce the amount of hours that we're spending on minutes traditionally without losing the main substance, and obviously not losing any of the minutes, or I'm sorry, the motions. And Emma is kind of taking lead on that tonight, this month. And so just the minutes may be a little shorter, I hope, but still, I hope capture the main points. Emma, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I think that's accurate. It's called the AI companion, I think, the pop-up that you see. So that's all that is. And yeah, I think if you want to get a sort of a flavor for how that worked, the executive committee minutes are on the website, and that was sort of our first attempt at this. It's sort of it's a merge. Like, I'm still taking minutes, I'm still capturing the motions, and so it is merging them together, but it does save a lot of time. So I'm grateful for that. So
yeah, so, and I think this is a little bit in response to just the workload on staff of we're spending, or individuals were spending many hours on the minutes, trying to get a lot of detail that maybe we can maybe dial it down just a little bit. So please, I think when you look at the minutes next month, any feedback would be welcome. How you think it's going, is it still close enough? And we'll make sure Catherine is still happy. That's really the ultimate goal. But that's a legislative update. Open meeting bill is, I think going, everything's getting close to town meeting day, right? So they're trying to get the crossover. S55, I think, is the open meeting law bill that I do think they're going to try to make some permanent changes. They were talking about requiring everybody to do hybrid meetings. I think they're backing off of that a little bit, but stay tuned. It still has another chamber to go through, so we'll see where it ends up. The other thing that came out of Senate GovOps, or is coming out of Senate GovOps soon, the other thing that Senate GovOps, I think they're calling it like a county governance study, but this just kind of issue of all the responsibilities that are on towns, and is Vermont really have the structure of government and local government right? Is there some other models that could be examined? So I'm not sure where that's going, but that's also coming out of Senate GovOps. And then river corridors and floodplains. Senate Natural Resources, I think, voted out a bill maybe today, S213, if you're interested in that, and working with A&R to look at maybe taking some of the floodplain river corridor responsibilities off of towns with a state level permit, with some option for municipal delegation still possible. So municipalities that want to could still regulate. And then there's a big housing omnibus bill that came out of Senate Economic Development last week, S311, that is housing omnibus, a lot of housing programs and stuff, but it also has some Act 250 stuff. The short-term Act 250 exemptions seem to be in that bill. And then it may get married up with H687, which is getting debated in House Environment and Energy, which is the Act 250 bill. And apologies to you all, because that has been definitely distracting a lot of my time. as they've been working through that. And happy to take any questions on all those things, and probably some other major bill I missed, but well, at least those are the ones that seem most relevant to our work. Any quick questions? Oh, thank you. You're being nice, and it's late. And then finally, on the internal work, thanks for the feedback on the code of conduct. That is all helpful, and there are a lot of moving parts here, and it does feel like as we're kind of working on our DEI work and how to be welcoming, you saw the executive committees looking at the staff version of the code of conduct as part of the personnel policy. At the same time, the other part of our personnel policy that kind of deals with job descriptions and benefits and salary ranges, we also have a compensation study going on board. So I think whenever we get done here in the next few months, we're going to have basically rewritten our entire personnel manual. Thank you. Thank you, Ann Nelson, for all that work, but also Forrest and the work he's doing on the compensation study. And so that's just to let you know that that is kind of going on, and all at the same time. And Jeff, as Jeff mentioned earlier, you may remember last month, we talked about doing a bylaws update to try to pull some of this together. We haven't started those meetings yet. Apologies, Catherine. I'll get in touch with you, and we'll schedule something, I think in the next month or two here to get that started. I expect that will take a few meetings, spring, summer, maybe into the fall, before we get that work done.
Like I said, we have to wait till after town meeting anyway.
That's right. That's right. Thanks. You did say that last month. That's
Yeah.
why we haven't had a meeting. Catherine told me to
That's
wait.
right. Because there's no way I could do anything before till after town meeting.
And I'm sure nothing will happen after that date either, right? Like you won't have to reorganize or set things in motion, get your budget done.
Yeah.
Yeah, any other questions for me? Otherwise, I will turn it back over to Chris. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. And seeing and hearing no further updates, we'll look to agenda item 11 in your packet. You can find committee liaison activities and reports for a deeper dive on what's been going on. We'll be looking forward to our next meeting on March 20th. And with that, agenda item 12, I'll be looking for a
I
motion.
move we adjourn.
Thank you, Jeff. A second.
I second.
I saw Bard.
I defer to Bard, please.
Yes, thank you. And I even saw Charlie try to raise his hand. Well, thank you all. If you're in favor, please raise your hand, say aye, or hit the leave button, and we will see you March 20th.